the intersection of money and politics. Welcome to Political Capital. Now, just how decisive will South Africa's land debate be come the 2019 elections? And who does it favor? For the ruling African National Congress, that's an opportunity to claw back some lost support. For the EFF, land trumps everything. For the Democratic Alliance, will its moderate view on the subject come at great political cost? We'll be talking about that with author and political economist Mr. Moeletsi Mbeki later on in the show. But first, a story that was made in the capital city that has ripples in Limpopo. Yesterday, we heard the governor describe what happened at VBS Mutual Bank as fraud. But the level of that fraud will determine South Africa's prudential powers and also test its resilience. I spoke to the Deputy Governor of the South African Reserve Bank, Kuben, about how the happenings at VBS Bank is creating a system that could face and plague the entire South African financial industry.
From a prudential point of view, what does it say to you in terms of the steps that we can put into place to make sure this doesn't happen?
Sure, we've got to make sure that it doesn't happen again. If there are any regulatory failings, we must be held accountable. If the regulator was asleep on the job or not doing their job, we must be held accountable. I certainly hope that at some point there will be an inquiry to look at what happened, what went wrong, and whether there were regulatory failings. In one sense, we rely heavily on audited statements from the auditors, or data that the bank provides to us, signed off either by the CEO or by auditors. In future, we may have to verify that more closely.
You said during the statement that you had urged VBS to apply for a full retail bank and not a mutual bank. And your suggestions were not taken to heart. How do we make sure that we enforce the regulator so that this is more than just a suggestion?
Sure. I think it would be great if the regulator has the legal instrument to force a bank to upgrade its license. I mean, we've got cooperative banks, mutual banks, and commercial banks. There's a big gap between mutual banks and commercial banks. We would certainly like the legal powers to be able to force a bank to transition from one to another if we think they've gotten too big or their business models become too complex.
Deputy Governor, part of the problem that has led us here is South Africa's, I guess, financial system. It's very hard to look at it outside of the powers of the auditor and what you as the regulator have to believe. There seems to be a bigger problem within the South African audit space, if you will, especially when you look at VBS and you look at internal auditors of PricewaterhouseCoopers and you look at external auditors of KPMG. How big is the problem, and can we expect another financial institution to also be dragged under as a result?
Sure, that's a good question. For the big banks, we require joint audits. Right? For the big banks, all the big banks in South Africa have two auditors, and we require a significant burden of proof from the audit committee that they've been through those audits in some detail. And when you've got two auditors, it appears as though auditors often put their better people on the job when they know they're being checked, not just by the public, but by another big auditor too. And so we've generally been happy with the quality assurance that we get from the auditing industry. Note that this is a tiny bank, 0.00016% of South Africa's banking system. So I do think that there's a problem on the auditing industry. I think it's a broader South African problem. We take significant steps to ensure assurance quality in the banking system. And in general, we're comfortable with the audited reports of the big banks.
You said that VBS was a small bank, while the auditors, the external auditors, were not exactly small. Are you worried about the systematic effect? Do you have to go look at all the audits that were done by KPMG so that you have an independent proof that yes, such is true?
You're absolutely right. The auditors of VBS were not small auditors. They were one of the big four auditors. I do think it's necessary for us to go back and look at what the information that we provided with. I don't think we've got the capacity to redo the entire financial statements of a big bank, but certainly we could do some verification and some testing. That's absolutely necessary.
The sheer size and scale of alleged fraud that took place at VBS Mutual Bank is starting to emerge with each day as the curator acquaints himself with how money moved in and mostly out of VBS Mutual Bank. Anoosh Rooplal, the curator, has now filed papers with the High Court asking it for the major shareholders of VBS Bank to be liquidated and for the individual directors of that investment vehicle to be sequestrated. I spoke to Anoosh about what to expect from his investigation.
You made an urgent court application on Friday citing that you would like individual executives of Vele Investments, which is the largest shareholder in the bank, to have their assets sequestrated. How quickly do you think we'll be hearing this urgent application, and what are you expecting really from it?
So the date, from what I understand, is around the 24th of July when this would be, the matter will be heard. And it's exactly that. It's to move with expediency and on an urgent basis in order to recover assets that essentially that belongs to VBS Bank. These assets were essentially, taken or siphoned out of the bank.
Some might say that the executives of VBS or of Vele Investment will still have enough time to maneuver assets and move things about only to make your job more difficult. Aren't you worried about something like that?
No, absolutely. That's a matter that has been discussed. It's clearly a concern, but I have got to follow the process. At the end of the day, it's the due legal process that needs to be followed. I think there's been a lot of fraud and illegal aspects. For example, the municipalities illegally putting their loans, their deposits into the bank. So I think the last thing we need now is the curator acting that's not in due process. So that's important for me. So yes, clearly, and hence the need for an urgent application to avoid further dissipation of assets.
Nedbank, how it was chosen to be the bank that now, in a day, I guess, inherits some 22,000 clients, courtesy of VBS. People are worried about interest rate charges. They're actually wondering how Nedbank's charges can be lower than most. So for the benefit of people who talk to us on social media, your response?
Yeah, sure. So there were 4 criteria, objective criteria that we had come up with in order to identify a suitable financial institution that would facilitate repayment of our depositors. And one of them was, so clearly it was 4. One of them is costs. Can the institution provide, or are their costs better or lower than what we currently provide, as an example? Secondly, there must be a commercially registered bank. More importantly, does the bank have branches in the same locality? In other words, in the same location as we operate, as VBS branches operates, and that's to minimize inconvenience, to our clients. And the last criteria was around products. The institution needed to have similar products because we have a depositor base that comprises of individuals, stokvels, burial societies. Does that bank have similar products? And having gone through that process, we then make recommendations to the Reserve Bank, and that's the basis as to how Nedbank, obviously came tops on all of those criteria.
A week ago, the viability of VBS to remain going was not in question. Right now, the probability of it going seems to have fallen. What has happened over the last few days that have, caused this change of mind within, I guess, the group that we saw today here as a panel?
Yes, so I guess that needs to be answered in context, right? Again, because when we assumed curatorship duties, the issue was around a liquidity crisis, and that was around 11 March. When we got stuck into the job, we expected to resolve a liquidity problem. We found further irregularities or other matters of governance weaknesses, internal control weaknesses, and so on. So that prompted me to then make a recommendation to the Reserve Bank to say we need to implement a forensic investigation. And then that exactly happened a month after we assumed curatorship duty. So that takes the timeline to around April. And the forensic investigator has been busy with that process and making findings available to us. Naturally, those findings were shared with us, which I then assessed. And so the bank has been a victim of a large-scale fraud. And that's exactly what's now turned the tide or has made me less confident than I was when we initially took over or took on the role.
Due to the preliminary findings of the investigator, you say that Vele executives must be held to account and therefore sequestrated. My question is, the report and your affidavit seems to go beyond just the bank executives. There seems to be some parties, connected people who seem to have benefited from the other side of this. Are you recommending any action be taken against them from a beneficiation point of view of this massive scale fraud?
Yes, so my job is to recover as much assets as I possibly can. So most certainly, that's the information that I've been provided to this point from the investigator via the SAB. And as and when more information comes to light, most certainly I will have to implement action in order to recover assets. And I think it's important to understand that this is not civil, that this is not criminal proceedings. As a curator, I'm implementing civil legal proceedings. So there's a big difference in that. Any criminal aspects obviously will be dealt with by Advocate Terry Motau and that team.
What's the next step for you as the curator going forward? And what else, apart from holding the individual directors to account, what other measures can we expect from you?
So I'm most certainly pleased that amidst the fraud that our retail depositors are taken care of. I think for me it's important that they're not lining up, sleeping outside a branch, a VBS branch, but rather will have full access to their money now. So that for me is clearly very pleasing. Secondly, the curatorship still continues. And again, the focus is on recovery of assets and finalizing the preparation of the financial statements, restating 2017 financial statements. And then at that point, we'll get a sense. And obviously, there will be more findings made available to us from the investigator. So it continues. It'll give me a sense of where we're at, and then I will take stock from there.
After the break, author and political economist Moeletsi Mbeki discusses how the land debate will decide South Africa's elections in 2019. Stay tuned.